Bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast, graciously donated by podbean.com. Wow. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Hauger History Podcast, special 8th grade edition here on this Friday. Having a fun Friday here in 2016, getting towards the end of September. Well, it just seemed like yesterday we were just getting into the dog days of Augie Doggy, and now we are moving into Sept, and soon we'll be in Oct. And we're moving on. A Yankee welcome today, sorry Red Sox fans, to an 8th grade edition of the Hauger History Podcast. In today's episode, we explore the draw and appeal of New England to colonial settlers in the 17th century who came to the New World. We're covering California History State Standard 5.3, aligning to many history standards across the land and across the world. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at Hauger History, and you can email us at haugerhistorypod@gmail.com. In today's episode, we explore the draw and appeal of New England. In 8th grade right now, our students are preparing a Colonial Sales Booth to draw potential settlers, 5th graders, who will come and view their boards in a classroom presentation, hear their slogans and their jingles, and attempt to persuade them to vote for their colony to settle in the New World. It should be a really fun project, and to help bolster the New England colonies information, this podcast exists. Students have been given groups of one of the 13 British colonies to promote as ad men or ad women, and to draw new settlers. So today we're going to offer some support to those students who are covering New England's territory and their appeal. When we talk about New England, 4 colonies: Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Why would you, as an English person, have chosen New England? Well, let's start with some of the tribulations and trials of the challenges of merry old England before it was the modern day merriness that we know today. It was a world power back then, but a lot of people were suffering from many different things: religious persecution for people wanting to celebrate their beliefs, the famine and starvation that was happening in Scotland and Ireland brought many people to the backcountry, and also settlers to New England. And so in August of 1607, the Plymouth Company arrived after some failed attempts that France and England had trying to settle the areas previously. Those attempts had withered, and early efforts were challenging. The Mayflower arrived in 1620 to establish colonies, buildings, and food supplies, and benefit from the knowledge of previous trials and failures. A foundational document happens here, one that would influence and affect even our American and democratic societies all over the world today, including the modern United States, and that was the Mayflower Compact. Signed on November 11th, the Mayflower Compact was the first written framework of government established in what is now the United States. The compact was drafted to prevent dissent amongst Puritans and non-separatist pilgrims who landed, and it was a rule of self-government. And in history, we really like talking about firsts. Here's a little bit of the primary source document. Primary source documents. That was a little more sinister than I intended. I apologize. In the name of God, amen. We those names who are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dead sovereign King Lord James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, and having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be needed and convenient for the general good of the colony. What does that mean? We're agreeing to rule ourselves. Simplified, right? We are agreeing on rules that we will govern by and live by for the benefit of every citizen. That was very much ahead of its time. Speaking of ahead of its time, in 1663, Rhode Island's charter was granted. Our student group that's covering Rhode Island came to me and said, Mr. Hauger, there's just not that much on Rhode Island. How should we celebrate? How should we advertise? It doesn't seem like fish are that exciting. What are the major draws that we could talk about? Well, according to Rollins College, they have a great list on their website of details. Rhode Island was ahead of its time in democratic solutions during an era and place where everything ultimately resided with the decisions of the crown. Back in England, they were running the show. So the ideals of progressive thinkers in Rhode Island created an environment where businessmen and plantation owners were able to instill a written constitution that would endure virtually unchanged for 100 years. It's extremely impressive. These ideals regarded freedom, free trade, and would eventually reflect the Constitution of the United States. The momentous action of people who were leaders in Rhode Island and the independence was one of the foundational things that led to the charter. The new version would also remain unchanged for another half a century. So they had very forward, progressive thinking. If you were a thinker back then, Rhode Island would be a great place to share your ideas in small town halls, and New England had great colonial towns. They were early masters of shipbuilding, fishing, and community government. The first houses in New England were simple wooden huts, but they evolved quickly. Rather than glass windows, they had paper soaked in oil. First chimneys used logs covered in plaster, obviously a fire hazard in today's standards, but the earliest houses were crowded, and they were giving many people reasons to come into town, and this substantial housing that would develop sooner as they became more prosperous and added new rooms also gave people the ability to open small businesses and to specialize. And eventually glass replaced windows and new things became new things while old things became older. That might be the most pointless sentence I've said so far. In this late 17th century, though, more important things happened. New England homes began to have specific rooms for living and dining. Culture and society and daily life began to really take shape. Carpets were placed on tables. They were too valuable to put on the floor. That's just a little fun fact, and a misspoken one at that. In New Amsterdam, buildings were at first made out of wood, but we started building houses with stone and brick. New England starts to be the first fashionable place to live. Thatched roofs were banned because of the risk of fire, and homes begin to get a little bit safer. So colonial food and drink, what were we eating back then in New England? In the 17th century, it wasn't safe to drink the water, you guys. It was too dirty. That's disgusting. At first, colonists were forced to use corn, and they made an alcoholic drink, but even that was dangerous. It was tough to get high degree of quality at the time. Beer and cider were common. For the wealthy, wine and brandy were imported. In the early 17th century, colonists relied mainly on corn for food. It made, and is still a staple in our American diet today, it was made into bread and mush, or eaten with beans in a meal called succotash. Remember Sylvester from Looney Tunes? Am I dating myself? Let's continue. Later in the 17th century, other grains like rye, wheat, and barley were grown. Colonists also grew vegetables like onions, turnips, parsnips, and carrots. I'm still thinking about dating myself. If meat was, what would it actually be like? Stay on topic, Mr. Hauger. Thank you, Mr. Hauger. If meat was available, stew was a popular meal. In the 17th century, people also rarely used utensils, but towards the 18th century, New England pioneers it, and it was more than common for two or more people to share a wooden plate. They called them trenchers back then. So that's a lot of minute detail about living, but some of the finer points, if you were trying, like my 8th graders are, to attract people to your colony, less than 5% of the population was slaves. So compared to the Middle and the South, you had a lower population of slaves, and people who were in that kind of labor or were more diversified. They could work in cottage industries like cobbling or going out on boats, or maybe in repairing items or refurbishing items. While it lacks the draw of the big cities that the middle colonies had with New York and Philadelphia, and it didn't have the southern wealth of the agricultural plantation system in the southern colonies, New England really did have a lot to offer. And I hope our conversation today has highlighted many of the things that made New England unique, special, and many of the small town traditions that still carry on in many portions of New England today. Well, that was 8 minutes of the appeal of New England. I hope you enjoyed listening. You can send your questions to haugerhistorypod@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter @haugerhistory. And for now, class is out of session. In session? So is the opposite out of session? I don't know. Anyways, have a great weekend, everybody. Mr. Hauger signing off, and thanks for our special listeners and questions we answered at a later time. We do appreciate your contact. Have a great day, all.